All right, let's start. Thank you for coming and then joining this workshop. And then I actually really great to see you all here. Actually, now the situation in Korea turned better, but anyway, just we organize this one online because I think that this online workshop would have another advantage, the gathering, the another people from a different, the geographical territory. So I think that this kind of pandemic, changed the way of our thinking and our way of doing our own job like this. So I really actually express my gratitude to the Dr. Hanggu Lee, and then he's the director of the Civilization Study Center, and then he supported this workshop, and then he also organized a series of this workshop for a long time. That might be quite a remarkable achievement in my opinion. So and then I would like to give the microphone to Hanggu Lee for a while, and then to express his own word for today. 한국 영우 교수님.
Okay. Hello, many scholars. Good morning. I am Hanggu Lee, Director of the Institute for Human Society at King University, Seoul, Korea. It is an honor to host a workshop with world-class scholars today. Today's workshop topic is logic of transformation of theories. And 5 scholars, Geoff Brady, Toshia Ueno, Peter Zhang, Majino N.Y., Taekwang Lee, will individually present a subtopic. I hope for good result. Thank you.
Thank you for good words and kind encouragement. Okay, thank you very much. And then, all right. So today we prepared this kind of the workshop titled on transition. Of course, yes. Now that we're facing a very immense the situation concerning this kind of crisis, and then what I mean climate change, and then even now we have Ukraine war, very tragic moment, and then I think actually this the situation marked kind of a grand the transition from the post-war system after Second World War and to the unknown or so unpredictable actually the future. And then I think that we should organize emergent actually the talk over this kind of transitory or transformative process, and then not really the very clear vision have been actually suggested by another scholar. Even the lots of geopolitical and the international relations study try to explain what happened these days, even the other field, but not many actually the discourse or some argument or discussion from this humanity area. So that was the main reason we rapidly actually or some kind of the quickly organize this kind of workshop for responding that the crisis from the perspective of humanity, not really actually the kind of geopolitical or some the international the relations study. So of course actually what we have today must be solved by there's such a political decision and political practice, but the people that kind of practice, we need the kind of idea or some what kind of things we should do, and then that's why just we need a sort of a philosophical intervention this situation. So I think today we put the problem and the topic on the table, and then open to the any discussion, and then we can share our idea. Of course, actually, we would already share lots of idea through many channels, but now that we they put together actually on this platform and then try to bring in. Of course, we couldn't have any answer to this crisis and then this question, but the philosophical task is to suggest question as such is a right question, like a Bergsonian the way or Bergsonian sense that we should actually put forward a right question, and then actually the practice will bring in kind of another the new practice. That's what we actually try to do today. All right, so I want to is over to first presenter Peter, and then who is it? Job? Sorry, Job will be first. All right. So and then Job, and then we'll give talk about very very exciting topic. He gonna give the critique of Byung-Chul Han and then many some little bit historical pessimism, of course, yes, and the kind of the word about the end of history, and then he will suggest very interesting the idea about how to deal with this kind of new historical pessimism today. All right, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to the workshop, and I really wish I were with you in Seoul. So I'm dying to get back to Korea to see everybody. But Tai-Kwang Lee asked me to make a presentation on transition, and I got very panicked about a week ago. So I've been working every day on a new thing, something new to discuss. And anyway, I'm quite pleased with it, but I've been editing it for the last week. So if there's one or two kind of things like, spelling mistakes, just forgive me. But what I intend to do is to share the text with you. So I heard you talking about the concern about translation and things like that. So I'm going to share my screen so you can you read it along with me. Is that okay? Does that make sense? I think that right. Well, let me share my screen then. This one. Can you see my screen? All right.
Yes.
Everybody? Yes, that's okay, right? It says it's just the title. So as Tai-Kwang said, this is concerned with Han Byung-Chul and the Russian philosopher Kojève and the late French philosopher Bernard Stiegler. And I'm doing it in connection with the Academy of Korean Studies. So it's kind of concerned with post-media studies and the question of eruption in South Korea. So anyway, that's what I intend to do today, is to talk about the move from, I suppose, from shallow to deep boredom, or from shallow attention to deep attention, and the question of Hegel and the end of history. So I'm going to put can you see the text now? Is that okay? Tai-Kwang, can you see the text?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no problem.
Okay, good. Okay, so
Don't
I'll
worry,
begin.
trust
then,
the Zoom. Yeah, trust the technology.
Well, anyway, right. So the first quotation is from Byung-Chul Han. He says, "We are facing a crisis again, a period of critical transition that another upheaval, the digital revolution, has occasioned." So I picked up on this idea of the nature of the critical transition in what we're all experiencing, which is the digital revolution. Okay, so I'll begin. Hopefully I'll get to the end. South Korea is a conundrum. Not only the Western media, but philosophers too love to obsess about its economic, political, social, psychical dimensions, its transitional dynamics and rituals, its perversion. How did Korea get so rich in such a short time? What's her secret? And why do the Koreans work so hard? In Han Byung-Chul's work, we find some answers about the transition from the disciplinary to the achievement society. We also find a discussion about the loss of rituals and the destruction of transition. Transition, thresholds, rituals are replaced by, quote, an accelerated and seamless communication and production. The construction of the global, he says, is premised on the ruthless of thresholds and transitions. Korea becomes global based on the destruction of thresholds and transitions. And Han writes about the fatigue society, which is driven by the logic of production for production's sake. In such a society, we exploit ourselves to the point of exhaustion and depression. Like Han, Italian philosopher Franco Berardi explores this aspect of mental health in his critique of planetary capitalism. Digital platforms produce a cognitive mutation that includes a propensity for autism and desensitization to the presence of the other, and fatally to suicide. Mental suffering is normalized in a system driven by the exploitation of precarious cognitive work. And advanced industrial societies like Korea are haunted by depression, loneliness, and suicide, he says. Discerning widespread stress and competition, a sense of meaningless and compulsion disorders, Franco Berardi finds this mutation in Korea, where digitization has deeply affected the psychology of its inhabitants. Berardi suggests a causal connection between connectivity and suicide. Well, for myself, I am interested in what Berardi said, and I'm interested in the question of the social recluse, or the hikikomori, in the Korean context. I have some questions. How is desire imperiled by burnout, fatigue, addiction, intoxication with technology, stress, anxiety? And what therapeutic practices are available to the social recluse? And to what extent does the sedentary life of the hikikomori exemplify the fundamental shifts in affectivity produced and commanded by technology in the Korean context? Well, today I'm going to address the idea of the achievement society. This is Han Byung-chul's idea, the achievement society, and the role of multitasking. This is very important for my argument, multitasking. And I'm going to try and hook together, excuse me, the thoughts of Han, Bernard Stiegler, Alexander Kojève, and the Japanese cultural theorist Azuma Hiroki. Okay, so there's something curious mentioned by Han Byung-chul about multitasking in his book, The Burnout Society. What's the nature of this multitasking? Han says that multitasking is nothing special to humans. It does not represent civilizational progress, and we cannot transition to a new civilization through it. This is a little odd perhaps, but multitasking is what wild animals do. They do this simultaneously when they feed their young and they watch out for predators. Now, this is a form of multitasking. Han says the regressive aptitude of multitasking also takes place in video game play. It produces what he says is a broad but flat mode of attention, which is akin to the vigilance of a wild animal. It also produces antisocial forms of behavior, such as bullying, and bullying is a huge social problem in Japanese education. In the Achievement Society, which Korea is one of the examples, with the Achievement Society, which is propelled forward by multitasking, there's a question of what form of attention this takes, this flat mode of attention. What is its nature? Is it shallow or is it deep? Curiously, Bernard Stiegler, the philosopher of technology, he too discusses the question of multitasking in his account of the attention mutation, which leads to attention disorders and information fatigue. So ADHD, even in its, quote, vigilant mode, says Stiegler, is a form of attention without consciousness, a characteristic of wild animals. So the idea of without consciousness is going to prove important in my argument. The idea of this multitasking wild animal made me think of the intellectual lineage from Hegel's great masterpiece, The Phenomenology of Spirit, all the way back in 1809, to Alexander Kojève's introduction to that work in the 20th century, and then to Francis Fukuyama's interpretation of, bad interpretation of Kojève, and then more recently, Azuma Hiroki's interpretation of the so-called Japanese Snobbery thesis, which he finds in Kojève. Just to give a quick definition, the Snobbery thesis interprets Japan's 250-year-long seclusion from the world in the Edo period of its history, finished late 1860s. Well, Azuma Hiroki in particular is, well, famous or infamous, I don't know, for his animalization thesis on the otaku generation. That's the geek, right? And their kind of archival fever for the database and for minor narratives. He says like the otaku is some kind of, I don't know really what to say. He's kind of like a Superman almost, or Overman, you know. Well, I think this concern for making minor narratives and making databases is a form of multitasking. Okay, so here's where the argument begins. What is multitasking at the end of history? This would, for me, imply that there is still something to do, a task which is futural and prospective and anticipatory. And can I be bored to death by it? The latter question is not, I'm not being facetious when I ask the question, because if I can be bored to death by multitasking, then I can introduce the negative. This is important, which is what Han is arguing for in his interpretation of Hegel. I'll explain about this in a moment. You see, negativity can be a form of transition. Well, when I was thinking about this, more questions emerged. Well, is multitasking a shallow or deep form of attention? And can we get from that kind of question of attention to a deep form of boredom? Okay, so from deep attention to deep boredom, what does that mean? Basically, the argument is that deep boredom would introduce the negative. And a deep form of attention is important for Han Byung-chul because this is how we might transition to a new civilization, one that is concerned with deep contemplation, one that is premised on maybe idle or stupid or idiotic ways of passing the time. Such a civilization would be premised on otium and leisure and laziness, on living perhaps like a philosopher and not like a wild animal. Nowadays, it seems we multitask because we are bored to death, and we do it unconsciously, and we are addicted to it, and we love our unconscious repetitions. Well, then, are we at the end of history, living as wild animals in an excess of positivity, like somehow like what Kojève calls the adult beasts, or what Gilles Châtelet would call the pigs, who are living in a kind of inertia of cyber cattle. Well, we know that Kojève discusses the animal in his introductory lectures on Hegel, and he's concerned with the becoming animal of man at the end of history. And we know that he kind of prevaricates or dithers on the question of the final state of history. Does it lead to the re-barbarization of Japan or the Japanization of the world? And this is the quote by Kojève about the adult beast. And this is where my argument connects with Han Byung-chul. Maybe I'm going to kind of just look at the last, well, is it the last? Yes, it is the last sentence. He talks about play. Play is a very important concept in our kind of achievement societies. We don't have play. His argument is somehow we would lose consciousness and we would somehow indulge in love like adult beasts. This is actually quite strange argument, I agree, but we wouldn't, well, hopefully I can explain what I mean by it as I progress, but the idea is to think about the loss of consciousness and somehow this notion of the adult beast or the wild animal, as I mentioned earlier. Well, Okay, so at the end of history, what becomes of happiness and satisfaction? And are we happy or satisfied when we multitask? If we are satisfied, do we not become like wild animals, somehow returning to nature? Do we disappear as man? And is the annihilation of man definitive? Or what may we transition to? Can the adult animal, the adult beast, can it love and care for the other person? Can it go over to the other? Can it transition to the other? My argument is like this. So I'm arguing that the animalized man may very well carry out an empty, ritualistic form of multitasking, a kind of shallow attention. But it's difficult to see what form of attention it would take. I can't really work it out. Is it shallow or is it deep? And this is where Azuma Hiroki and the Dobutsuka, the animalization thesis, comes in. The otaku, the geek, is the animalized man. But in this case, love is not love for the other, but it's a perverted, multitasked love for playing games, video games, or simulation games, for some kind of virtual eros, for moe, which is to say that kind of so-called pure affection we have towards characters in manga, anime, and video games. However, I know that the animalization thesis says that man is without consciousness. This is the sticking point. So man is realized in the object, and therefore, strictly speaking, self-consciousness is no more. And without self-consciousness, there is neither art nor love. So the Kojève quote I mentioned earlier is somehow art is transformed in this end of history experience. If that's the case, then the negative, we can't have the negative, it's incapacitated, and there's no creativity, and action is empty, and there are no tasks. So that's why my argument, multitasking, has some problems. Well, the post-human way of life at the end of history is form without value. This is Kojève's idea. And here both Kojève's snobbery thesis, the Japanese during Edo had a peculiar way of passing the time, despite being a so-called at the end of history. And then we have Azuma Hiroki's animalization thesis. These arguments demonstrate this point, I think. Snobbery, that is form without content, is ritual as such. And it exists so that the Japanese can pass time and not get bored at the end of history. And indeed, Han Byung-chul picks up on this and claims that Japan is the coming realm of ritual. The Japanese can multitask and not be bored, but there's no struggle for life. But rather somehow the suspension of struggle becomes empty and ceremonial. So again, my argument is a kind of stumbling here, because we shouldn't forget that the animal the animal as such cannot be bored, because it's what Heidegger would say is pouring world. And no animal can be a snob. Only man can be bored, and in fact, only man can be a snob. And only man can experience what Heidegger would call profound boredom. Okay, so my question is how to get from shallow to the deep sense of attention, and then to get to a deep form of boredom. Because my argument is that because from boredom, the negative emerges. I said that earlier. And this is important because it says something about the role of philosophy and the role of friendship. And Han Byung-chul picks up on Deleuze and Guattari on the role of friendship. And I'll return to Deleuze and Guattari at the end. Well, first of all, let me return to Han Byung-chul, who describes society as suffering weariness and transparency. In this achievement, society's citizens compete compulsively in this kind of post-disciplinary world. Burnout, fatigue, exhaustion are common maladies. And then through self-exploitation or auto-exploitation, we are overexposed to ourselves. This is the transparency aspect. And we are cut off from relation to the other. From this, depression, hyperactivity, and personality disorders ensue. And self-exploitation and indeed multitasking produce fatigue and depression. And we suffer an excess of positivity. There's no room for the negative. And Han Byung-chul, to his credit, wants us to embrace the thresholds which can transition to negativity. This is so because the sense of negativity would allow us to relate to the other, would allow us to love, would allow us to transition to the unfamiliar. Because love brings something incomprehensible or incomparable into the world. And this would help us to transition to a new civilization. But Han goes back to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and looks at the relationship of spirit to death and picks up what Hegel talks about in the introduction as spirits tarrying or playing with the negative. This is very central for Han Byung-chul's argument because he's looking to find a way to affirm the agony of eros, passion as such, to show how eros is tied to the logos as such. Okay, so without negativity, we can't love. The excess of positivity is no solution to this crisis of love. And I've said that wild animals or adult beasts can't love, according to Kojève, and they are poor in world. And I think so are we. Why is this so? Well, in our enclosure within ourselves, we suffer a primordial form of narcissism and self-reference, what I will call a deadly ipseity of the self. This is a compulsive repetition, an addiction. This leads to a loss of eros, a loss of desire, a loss of relation to the other, and a loss of relation to the non-self, to the not-self. And therefore, from that, then we have a plethora of tasks, of which pornography and exhibitionism are conspicuous, and these replace love and desire. And love becomes a simulation, as I said with the otaku. And I find this sense of love ridiculously kind of found in moe, and no real relationship to a concrete human being. And again, this returns me to the animalization thesis by Kojève and the idea which is popularized by Azuma Hiroki. Azuma Hiroki, I would say, is writing a kind of following Boris Groys, in fact, the Russian philosopher. Azuma Hiroki is writing a kind of post-coital retrospective on database animalization. I quite like that sentence. Okay. Well, for Han, the agony of eros leads to the agony of thought, because without the desire for the other, there's no possibility of philosophy as such. Logos without eros would be abstract, empty thought. It would be a ritual. It would be, ceremonial. Well, we need love to do philosophy and to not be bored. Otherwise, we are left with what Han Byung-chul calls pornographication and gamification and simulation at the end of history. Form without content is a kind of empty ritualization. The logos without eros, okay, as I said, the logos without eros, is what Kojève finds to be the adult beast, okay? But I think in our time, this has been transformed into what Bernard Stiegler calls la bête immonde, the hideous beast. This is when desire is destroyed and when especially young people act out the drives in violence against the other, Well, let me explain about that more, okay? Stiegler says that when drives, like our primordial drives, are untied from desire, we are left, and they're left unsublimated. And this is a disaster for society. We can't have a society which is asocial, which is antisocial. It's the end of the social as such. This leads in extremis to the eruption of violence, the la bête immonde, the hideous beast, and then to the destruction of society as such. So there's no transition to a new civilization. Well, in Han's language, this may include the psychic effects of media flooding, which erupts when the achievement subject is no longer able to achieve. So when you can't achieve, then there's a breakdown. Something erupts. And this is also the schizo breakdown, which Deleuze and Guattari talk about in Anti-Oedipus. they call this schizo breakdown, the limp rag forced into autistic behavior. So this kind of reclining into the self, kind of autism. Well, I hope it's become a little bit clear, but my argument has been to stress the importance of desire. Okay, to note what has happened to desire through the depletion of libidinal energy, and how desire is affected by states of fatigue, exhaustion, and the absence of eros. Here, Han's psychopolitics of capitalism, I think, offers a critical treatment of digital technologies, but when we read it alongside Stiegler's pharmacological analysis of the digital, so the poison and cure of the digital. But that is true, but it's Deleuze and Guattari who still have something to say. Okay, so question, how do we transition to a new civilization? Well, I remain resistant to the idea of mindfulness, to somehow finding in Buddhism a solution to the crisis of the achievement subject, to somehow escaping, our empty multitasking. This is what Han Byung-chul leads towards, and indeed he writes about Zen Buddhism. This is not my thing. While mindfulness is not my path from what Han calls the flat mode of attention to deep attention, that said, I agree with Han, who claims forms of negativity such as boredom, okay, or hesitation or pausing, they can be constructive and can put into question society's increasing positivity. For him, simply, not all forms of negativity are destructive. But for me, this move is unsatisfactory because nothing will be changed in capitalism by merely becoming the beautiful soul. Nothing will transition to another way of ordering the world. And therefore, sadly, Han's work, while thought-provoking, does not get us to the question of how the multitasking depressive acts formally without content. How does the depressive disavow the reality of its own self-exploitation? How does capitalism produce such disastrous forms of subjectivity? Well, to some extent, we might need a new pedagogy of lingering, of deep boredom, of quiet attunement and quiet viewing. These are all Heideggerian concepts, of vita contemplativa. And I think philosophy can be that form of deep contemplative attention, which can make us less bored. So perhaps withdrawal, like a hikikomori kind of withdrawal, into philosophical idiocy and stupidity might be a way to transition towards the self's relation to itself. But this is my conclusion now. But if this is accepted as a transitional step, I think we need to delve deeper and fatally into profound boredom, to search out the possibilities for action, to disenchant ourselves and to burst asunder the fetters of the achievement society. A critique of the excess of the positive must account for the negativity of the schizo. This is the schizo would be the figure of breakdown, like the hikikomori. But again, alas for Han Byung-chul, this is the wrong path to take. Han Byung-chul is critical of the so-called romanticized and idealized schizo image produced by Deleuze and Guattari in the 1970s. The body without organs, okay, this kind of mysterious concept that they have, has become decrepit. It's become overrun with metastases and infarction. That's like a tissue kind of death or necrosis. Well, Han Byung-chul says that this crazy, goofy language of schizophrenic deterritorialization leads not to the negative, but to the rhizomatic proliferation of the same, to accumulation of the positive. And maybe he's got a point. And he charges Deleuze and Guattari with writing a kind of paean to capitalism, a kind of celebration of capitalism. As he says, freed from all negativity, the schizo machine produces the violence of positivity. So there is no negativity, just an excess of the positive. So the schizophrenic process of desire has lost its diabolical, destructive, negative dimension. But I'm writing, this is my position against people like Han Byung-chul. I think we must affirm the destructive transitional nature of desire its pure possibility and negative capacity. Why? Because for otherwise we remain like ensnared wild animals, encaptivated by the capitalist mode of production, consumption, and exchange, which is to say that diabolical accelerative production which nurtures auto-exploitation and as such depletes libidinal energies, exhausts the mind, and confounds the negative. That is, the capacity to say no to capitalism's paranoid, depressive, and suicidal functioning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.